The honourable member for Wellington Halton Hills.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll be splitting my time with the member for Lakeland. Mr. Speaker, Canada's security is inextricably linked to that of Europe's, and it has been for centuries. Where once the conflicts between the French and British empires had a direct impact on us here on this continent. Conflicts between the Spanish Empire and other empires had a direct impact on our security here in this continent, to today, where our security is inextricably linked to that of Europe's. Mr. Speaker, in the last century, in the First and Second World Wars, Canada's security was inextricably linked to that of Europe. We all know the names of where Canadian blood was shed in defense of this country and its values. Names like Passchendaele, Vimy Ridge, the Battle of the Somme. Think about the Second World War and the names that are indelibly etched into the minds of Canadians. Names like Juno Beach and Normandy and Arnhem. In fact, it was Canadian soldiers who, in 1945, liberated the Netherlands. Some 7,000 Canadian soldiers died in the canals, the fields, and the villages of the Netherlands, liberating the Dutch from the tyranny of Nazism. In the 20th century, some 100,000 Canadians died defending this country in 2 world wars. 60,000 Canadians died on the battlefields of France in the First World War. Some 40,000 Canadians died around the world during the Second World War, most of them in Europe. And almost all of those Canadians are buried in graves that dot the Normandy coastline, the fields of Normandy, the Netherlands, Italy, and so many other places throughout Europe. And after the First World War, because of the blood that had been shed, Canada began to gain her independence. The Balfour Declaration led to the Treaty of Westminster and eventually to Canada's independence from the United Kingdom. And after the Second World War, because of the high price we paid, we were a founding member in 1949 of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Canada was and continues to play a key role in peace and security across Europe. In fact, Canada has contributed to every single NATO mission since the alliance's inception in 1949. We are one of only 2 countries that are the non-European members of the NATO alliance. And now, Mr. Speaker, NATO is being threatened. An estimated 130,000 Russian troops are built up on the Ukrainian border, but we have a government that has failed to take any real action to support Ukraine. We are facing a situation today of grave consequence. While the government on January 21st announced a loan of $120 million to Ukraine, and while they recently announced the extension and expansion of Operation Unifier, they have failed to grant the key request of the government of Ukraine, which is to provide lethal defensive weapons to Ukraine for her defense. The United States has provided some $650 million in defense equipment, $200 million of which is lethal aid for Ukraine. The United Kingdom has supplied lethal aid, lethal weapons in the form of anti-tank weapons. Others, such as Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and the Czech Republic, also have provided lethal weapons. Mr. Speaker, diplomacy not backed up by credible threats of the use of military force, and in limited and rare circumstances, the use of that force is naive talk and empty rhetoric, and that empty talk and rhetoric that will result in damage to Canada's security and the security of Europe and Ukraine. That's what a previous generation of Canadians understood in 1945 when they created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization out of the bloodshed that had happened in the previous 50 years. That's not something that this current Prime Minister understands, who said that this will only be solved through diplomacy and not through the threat of force to defend democracy. And so, Mr. Speaker, I urge the government to get off its naive position, defend the rules-based international order, and ensure that lethal defensive weaponry is provided to a democracy, to Ukraine, in order to uphold that order. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. The honourable member for Scarborough-Guildwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his speech, which was thoughtful and historical. And I wanted to get his views on a quote where nations don't have friends or enemies, they only have interests. And I'd like him to articulate why, as the member from Etobicoke Centre did, why it is in Canada's best interests that we give full-throated support to Ukraine.
The honourable member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The answer to the question is simple. For centuries, Canada's security, the safety and security of our citizens, the safety of and security of our borders is inextricably tied to that of Europe. And if Europe is being threatened, if democracies in Europe are being threatened with an attack, with invasion, then Canada must stand up, not only for the security of those nations in Europe, but for the security of Canadians here at home, and provide all assistance necessary to ensure that happens. Assistance, including diplomacy, humanitarian aid, and assistance, including the threat of use of force and lethal defensive weapons, as the government of Ukraine has requested.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. The honourable member for Interlake, Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank my colleague, Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, the MP for Hull, or never mind. Shadow Minister for I just went brain dead there. I'll just say this: that he has been just a great, reasonable voice on foreign affairs in our caucus and in this House. And I know that he takes what's happening in Ukraine very seriously, as he just articulated. And I know, if he could just elaborate more, that the world is watching what happens right now in Ukraine. Despots around the world are waiting to see what NATO and the alliance does in response to these threats from the Russian Federation and Vladimir Putin in particular. And if we are not able to contain the situation and protect Ukraine's sovereign territory and the people of Ukraine, what possibly could happen by other despots who see the position Canada has taken and other nations as weak?
For Wellington, Halton Hills.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I couldn't agree with my colleague more. In fact, what is going on right now often reminds me of the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s, where the duly elected and recognized government of Spain, the Republican government of Spain, was under threat from the nationalists, from a civil war and a coup d'etat that had erupted, led by Spanish generals. And Spanish Republicans pleaded to Western democracies to provide lethal defensive weapons, lethal military weapons for the defense of Spanish Republicans. But democracies in the 1930s turned a blind eye and refused those military weapons. But Germany and Italy, being fascist powers at the time, sent plenty of weapons to the nationalists, who eventually triumphed, leading into the dark events of the war of 1939 to 1945. And when I hear about governments, democracies, refusing to send lethal defensive weapons to a fellow democracy under threat from another authoritarian regime, it brings me back to that period of time in the 1930s where we as democracies turned a blind eye to rising authoritarianism in Europe and paid a very high price over the subsequent 6 years to 1945. And that is the lesson we have failed to heed from the situation that's currently unfolding in Eastern Europe.